Reformed thinking. You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this comforting expectation of precision.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It feels almost like engineering in a way.
Right. I mean, you fall off a ladder, you
Yeah.
break your arm, and the doctor puts the x-ray up on that glaring white light board,
Mhm.
and they just point a pen at that jagged line and say, well, there it is. That is the fracture.
It is very binary, broken or not broken.
Yeah, and we love that kind of clarity,
Mm.
We like things to be visible, categorized, and solvable.
Right, we want to see the problem sitting right there on the surface.
So we can put a cast on it, sign it with a marker, and just move on with our lives.
Yeah.
But, well, then you step out of the physical realm and into the unseen world of human motives and hidden affections.
And eternal destinies, yeah.
Yes, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just totally useless.
Mm.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
It really is. It is so easy to assume everything is fine just because the outside looks presentable.
Which brings us to our topic today. We are taking a magnifying glass to the famous words of Jesus in Matthew 7, specifically verses 24 and 25.
The parable of the wise and foolish builders.
Yeah. Our mission for this deep dive is to look past the superficial, visible architecture of our lives and uncover the absolute bedrock of true discipleship.
That is a critical mission because, right now you might be sitting in a car commuting down a busy highway.
Or maybe you're staring at a spreadsheet at your desk with a cup of coffee.
Or taking a walk around your neighborhood. We can safely assume your life feels relatively stable at this precise moment.
Right. The sky is clear, the ground feels firm. But the central question screaming out from this historical text is this: when the sudden violent storms of life hit, or when the final, terrifying reality of divine scrutiny arrives, what is actually holding up the floor beneath your feet?
I mean, that is the terrifying and necessary question to ask because it is incredibly easy for human beings to assume we are standing on solid ground simply because the sun happens to be shining today.
Oh, for sure. We do that all the time.
We constantly evaluate our structural integrity based on the current weather rather than the actual dirt beneath us.
Yeah.
And this text refuses to let anyone get away with that kind of self-deception. It forces a person to look past the comfortable and interrogate the unseen reality of their existence.
Because Jesus, in this historical moment, is not handing out quaint moral advice for a happier, more productive Tuesday, is he?
No, not at all. He is delivering a definitive, searching, and pastoral ultimatum. He is drawing a sharp, unyielding line between a life that will stand and a life that will experience a catastrophic collapse.
Right, because every single person breathing oxygen right now is a builder. You're building something today. No one lives without a structure to their life.
The question is never whether we are building, but what we are building upon. I mean, some people use their professional reputation or their family pedigree.
Or religious familiarity, or emotional highs.
Yeah, exactly. Others build on cynicism, personal achievement, or just the shifting approval of their peer group. But the text strips all the paint and drywall away and demands we examine the dirt itself.
So let's talk about that dirt. Because if we're going to understand what Jesus is actually saying here, we logically have to look at the physical geography of first-century Palestine.
We do, yeah.
He was speaking to a specific crowd sitting on a specific hillside, and understanding the literal ground they walked on gives this metaphor its teeth.
Oh, absolutely. We are talking about a region with severe, almost violent weather patterns.
Right. So I want to look at these geological features called wadis.
Mm-hmm.
What is a wadi, physically speaking, and why does understanding it change the way we hear this parable?
Well, the Syro-Palestinian landscape is very rugged. It is unforgiving, and it is defined by extremes.
Okay.
During the blistering summer months, the region experiences a massive dry season. And in this terrain, you have these features called wadis, which are essentially dry riverbeds, ravines, or gullies.
Just empty ditches, basically.
Essentially, yes. But because they have been baked by the relentless sun for months, and because they were smoothed out by previous water flow, they look like these incredibly flat, smoothly compacted, absolutely flawless plots of land.
Wow. Okay, so if you are a builder looking for a site to construct a home in the middle of July, a wadi looks like an absolute gift.
It looks perfect. It is perfectly level. It requires very little sweat to start laying your stones.
You do not have to spend weeks clearing away massive boulders or fighting with uneven rocky terrain.
Right. It is visually appealing, highly convenient, and incredibly fast to build upon.
But here, the climate in that region experiences a violent shift in the winter, right?
A huge shift. When the winter rains arrive, they do not come as a gentle afternoon drizzle. torrential rain hits the surrounding mountains, and all that displaced water has to go somewhere.
Oh, wow. It channels directly into these ravines.
Yes, within moments, those dry, peaceful, perfect-looking gullies are turned into raging, violent flash floods. The water annihilates everything in its path.
That is terrifying.
So a builder who chooses the easy, flat wadi in July is going to see his entire life's work eradicated in December.
I mean, that just paints a staggering picture, doesn't it?
Hmm?
To put it in modern terms, it makes me think about housing developments built on floodplains.
Oh, that is a great comparison. You see this all the time.
Yeah, developers buy up this cheap, flat, gorgeous land right near a river. It is quick to develop, the framing goes up fast, and the houses look beautiful in the spring.
And people buy the homes because it is convenient, it is affordable, and the view is great.
Right, but the locals, the people who actually know the history of the land and the weather patterns, look at those shiny new houses and just shake their heads.
Because they know a 100-year flood is eventually going to come and wash the entire subdivision away.
Exactly. The builder took the easy, fast route without considering the inevitable shift in the climate. But taking this back to the first century, did the original Jewish audience sitting on that hillside hear this with a specific political filter?
They absolutely did.
Because they were living under a military occupation.
Right. Yes, their historical reality colors everything. The original audience lived under the crushing weight of Roman occupation. They were a subjugated people dealing with high taxation and political frustration.
And a desperate, burning desire for national deliverance.
Right. They were longing for a Messiah, but their expectation was heavily political and militaristic. They wanted a conqueror who would ride in, slaughter the Romans, reestablish the physical throne of David in Jerusalem, and build an earthly kingdom.
So they were looking for a political foundation to fix their problems.
Yes, and Jesus steps onto the scene and completely bypasses that expectation. He redirects their focus entirely.
How so?
He shows them that the real terminal issue threatening them was not the Roman boot outside the land. The fatal issue was the sin inside the human heart.
Oh, wow. And the religious leaders of the day, specifically the scribes and Pharisees, were missing this entirely.
Completely missing it. Those leaders had built an elaborate, towering, highly visible religious system. They had manufactured thousands of microscopic rules, oral traditions, and outward legalistic practices.
And to the general public, they looked incredibly pious. They were the religious elite.
But Jesus is declaring that this entire impressive, towering religious structure is built right in the middle of a wadi. It is constructed on the dry sand of human merit and external performance.
It looks phenomenal in the dry season of cultural approval, but it possesses zero structural integrity to survive divine scrutiny.
That is spot on.
I want to pause and address you, the listener, directly for a second, because this forces a very uncomfortable self-examination. You have to ask yourself, are you building your life, your career, your family structure, your religious habits in a dry season?
That is a tough question.
It is. Is your current sense of stability just a byproduct of favorable cultural weather? Are you relying on the fact that things are relatively peaceful right now, completely unprepared for a sudden, violent change in the climate of your life?
It is so easy to construct a life that looks completely functional when there's absolutely no pressure testing it.
Because human nature craves the easy plot of land. We want the quick results, the visible success, without the agonizing, unseen labor of digging down to something solid. We prefer checklists because checklists are easy to measure.
And that is the precise psychological trap. We deceive ourselves into thinking that because the house is currently standing, the foundation must be secure.
Yeah, the Pharisees were absolute masters of this specific self-deception, weren't they?
Oh, the best at it. They equated their biological descent from Abraham, along with their meticulous adherence to man-made traditions, with guaranteed spiritual security. They thought their ethnic heritage and their very public rituals were the bedrock.
And Jesus looks at all that religious resume and calls it sand.
He demands that the audience look past the visible architecture of their lives and examine the unseen reality beneath the floorboards.
Because a life that seems remarkably stable in fair weather will be exposed as ruinously unstable when the actual testing comes.
Right, and this was a radical, highly offensive message to the religious establishment of the first century, and frankly, it remains a highly offensive message to our modern sensibilities today because it strips away our illusions of control.
And Jesus did not just drop this building metaphor out of nowhere, like some random proverb. He decided to share on a Tuesday afternoon. This parable is the grand, sweeping climax to the greatest sermon ever preached.
The Sermon on the Mount, found in Matthew chapters 5 through 7.
Yeah. He is wrapping up a massive, systematic theological argument. What was Jesus doing in those chapters leading up to this final, devastating metaphor?
Well, we have to look at that context because isolating these verses distorts their meaning entirely. Throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus systematically dismantles the false, superficial righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees.
Okay, so he takes the law of God, which religious leaders had conveniently reduced to manageable external physical rules.
And he elevates it to its terrifying spiritual reality. He tells the crowd that murder is not just the physical act of taking a life. Murder is the unseen anger burning inside the chest.
Wow. And he says adultery is not just the physical act, it is the lustful intent of the mind. He demands absolute perfection, not just outward conformity.
Yes. He addresses hidden motives, secret piety, the nature of prayer, fasting, and the idolatrous love of money. He is painting a picture of kingdom citizenship that is completely impossible to achieve through human effort.
Right. He demands a righteousness that far exceeds the most rigorous religious professionals of his day.
And that leads right into the verses that come immediately before our passage about the builders, which are truly chilling.
I am talking about Matthew 7:21-23. Jesus describes a scene at the final judgment where people are standing before him and they are completely confident.
They are not cowering, they are boasting.
Yeah. They say, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? They are rattling off a spectacular spiritual resume.
And Jesus responds with arguably the most devastating sentence in all of Scripture. He says, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.
Let me ask the obvious question here. These people were doing literal miracles. They were casting out demons. They had spectacular spiritual experiences, and Jesus still rejects them as lawless. How does a person casting out demons end up building on the sand?
This is a critical, terrifying connection. These false converts had built their entire assurance of salvation on subjective, charismatic experiences and outward, pragmatic success.
Okay.
They looked at their ability to prophesy or to perform mighty works or to gather a crowd, and they concluded that their standing with God must be secure.
They equated spiritual excitement and visible ministry success with genuine faith.
Yes. But Jesus calls them workers of lawlessness. Why? Because mystical phenomena, ecstatic experiences, and even impressive ministry results, when divorced from actual submission to the revealed will of the Father, are nothing but sand.
Well, the transition word right there in verse 24 is therefore. Jesus says, everyone therefore who hears these words of mine.
He is directly linking the eternal doom of those charismatic false converts to the necessity of true structural obedience. He is saying, because false assurance based on subjective experience leads to eternal ruin, therefore, you must build on the objective truth of my words.
Think about what that means for the average person sitting in a pew today. We live in a modern church culture filled with people who have walked an aisle, repeated a prayer, felt a massive emotional high during a worship song, and now consider themselves absolutely secure for eternity.
But their daily lives, their private habits, their business practices, the way they speak to their spouse, are utterly indistinguishable from the rest of the secular world.
Right. They are relying on a past emotional experience while living in active current rebellion. The reality is that is the exact same sandy foundation as the false converts in Matthew 7. Subjective feelings, goosebumps, and tearful altar calls are not bedrock.
If you separate hearing the word from doing the word, you are constructing a spectacular house right in the middle of a wadi. A large segment of the modern evangelical movement often promotes a Christianity without a cross, a salvation without repentance, and a profession of faith without any corresponding obedience.
It measures success by the size of the crowds, the intensity of the emotional responses, and cultural relevance.
But Christ measures success by a life actively submitted to his authority. The individuals crying, Lord, Lord, had the correct vocabulary. They had massive enthusiasm. They even had visible spiritual power.
But they lacked the one single thing that proved their faith was genuine, which is a life characterized by obedience to the Father's will.
They treated Jesus as a useful tool to facilitate their own religious experiences, rather than bowing to him as an absolute sovereign king.
So let's look closely at the specific prescription Jesus gives next, because the original Greek text reveals something fascinating about how this building actually happens. The text says, everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them.
Right.
The verbs for hears and does are not describing a one-time event, are they? What are the mechanics of these words?
The grammatical structure reveals a continuous reality. The word for hears is akue, and does is poie. Both of these action words are in a tense that conveys continuous, ongoing, habitual action.
Okay, so it is not a one-and-done deal.
Precisely. Jesus is not describing a person who heard the gospel once at a youth camp 20 years ago and made a one-time emotional decision. He is not describing a person who occasionally performs a random good deed when they feel particularly inspired.
The grammar describes a relentless, habitual, continuous trajectory of life.
It is like breathing. You do not take one breath and say, well, I breathed, I am good for the decade.
Yeah, that would not end well. You breathe continuously because it is the necessary function of life.
The wise builder is characterized by an ongoing lifestyle of receiving the master's commands and executing them. It is a persistent posture of listening and obeying.
And the word Jesus uses for the wise man is highly specific. He doesn't use a word that means a philosopher or an intellectual giant with a massive IQ.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't describe someone who just sits around a university thinking deep, abstract thoughts. The word is phronimos. What does that actually convey about the builder?
Well, in the classical world, there is a stark distinction between abstract intellectual knowledge, which was often called Sophia, and practical, moral, street-level wisdom, which is related to phronimos.
Oh, okay.
The New Testament uses phronimos to denote a shrewd, far-seeing individual who has intense spiritual common sense. This is a person who looks at reality, accurately assesses the true nature of things, and acts deliberately to secure their future based on that stark reality.
So it is a highly practical, execution-oriented word.
Yes. To hear the absolute truth of the gospel, to know that a definitive storm of divine judgment is coming, and to simply ignore it and build your life on the sand is not just a moral failure. It is cosmic stupidity.
It is a fundamental failure to accurately assess reality.
The phronimos is wise because they align their physical daily actions with the truth their ears have heard.
I love the idea of spiritual common sense. It makes me think about a survival scenario. Imagine you are about to fly over the Alaskan wilderness, and right before takeoff, you download a highly detailed, perfectly accurate survival manual onto your phone.
Okay.
The plane crashes. You survive the impact, but you are stranded. You have the manual. You know it contains the exact instructions for filtering water, building a thermal shelter, and signaling for a rescue team.
Right.
The download is the hearing. It is absolutely necessary. You cannot survive without the information. But if you just sit in the freezing wreckage, holding the device, acknowledging that the manual is brilliantly written, maybe even memorizing a few chapters to quote yourself.
But you refuse to actually open it and execute the physical instructions.
Exactly. The doing. The result is fatal. The download was useless because it never translated into physical action. Hearing the word of Christ is a non-negotiable prerequisite, but doing it is the actual mechanism of survival.
That is a great way to put it. The Protestant tradition has always maintained that truth must be apprehended by the mind before it can be embraced by the affections and obeyed by the will. Hearing is the absolute starting point.
Faith comes by hearing.
But Jesus is confronting a religious culture that equated the mere act of hearing with genuine piety. The Pharisees were professional hearers. They studied the scrolls endlessly. They debated the nuances of the text for hours.
And today we have people who consume endless theological content, read massive volumes of systematic theology, and attend 4 different Bible studies a week, accumulating vast amounts of data.
But without execution, that stockpiled knowledge just condemns them further. The active doing of the word is the dividing line between wisdom and folly.
Let's talk about the bedrock itself. Jesus gets very specific about the Greek word used for rock. He uses the word petra.
Yes, Petra.
He doesn't use the words for gravel like chalx or loose rubble. He doesn't use the common word for a detached stone or a boulder you could roll away, which is lithos. Why does the distinction of Petra matter so much when we picture this wise man building?
The lexical choice is deliberate and vital. Petra refers to massive, solid, native bedrock. It is an immovable, unyielding shelf of rock embedded deep within the Earth's crust. It denotes absolute permanence.
And Luke's parallel account of this exact sermon adds a fascinating detail. Luke says the wise man dug deep. He had to excavate.
And we have to remember, digging in the ancient world was not a matter of renting a backhoe. This was agonizing, back-breaking, blister-inducing physical labor.
Oh, yeah. In the context of the wadi we discussed earlier, you have to dig through all that loose, easy topsoil. You have to shovel past the gravel, the dirt, and the sand.
Theologically speaking, that topsoil represents our inherent pride, our reliance on human tradition, our self-righteousness, and our resume of good deeds.
It is incredibly hard, humiliating work to push all of that aside and admit that absolutely none of it can hold your weight. You have to keep digging until your shovel hits something that cannot be moved. That is the Petra.
While the foolish builder just avoids the labor altogether, he wants the visible result, the impressive house, as quickly and painlessly as possible so people can admire it.
But the wise builder is willing to delay the visible construction. They're willing to look foolish while staring into a hole in the ground to ensure the unseen foundation is anchored to reality.
And that native bedrock of Petra represents the absolute, unyielding authority of Christ and his spoken word.
Now, we need to stop right here and ask a vital theological question because I know someone listening is feeling a tension.
Oh, absolutely. The tension is very real.
They're thinking, hold on a second. If I have to work this hard, if I have to do all this agonizing digging and continuous doing and relentless obeying to survive the final storm, aren't we just earning our salvation through our own works?
Which would contradict the rest of the New Testament.
Right. Isn't this just a works-based religion? How do we resolve this tension between God's free grace and this intense demand for obedience?
This is perhaps the most critical theological distinction to make when reading this text. This passage is absolutely not teaching salvation by works. The framework of justification and sanctification clarifies this perfectly.
Let's break that down.
Sinners are justified, meaning they are declared legally righteous before God by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. We do not earn our standing. We bring nothing to the table but our sin.
However, the faith that justifies is never ever alone.
Right. Genuine, saving faith always, inevitably produces the fruit of obedience. The passage is a ferocious defense of sanctification as the necessary proof of justification.
So to put it simply, doing the words of Christ does not merit our salvation. That would be legalism. We're not laying bricks to build a staircase up to heaven.
No, not at all.
But doing the words of Christ proves that we actually possess the salvation that was freely given to us. It is the visible evidence of an invisible reality.
We have to reject both legalism, which says work so that you can be saved, and antinomianism, or easy believism, which says believe and how you live doesn't matter at all.
Right. Obedience is the unavoidable proof of saving faith.
The legalist trusts their own doing without ever resting in Christ. The antinomian claims to hear the word while outright refusing to do it. The wise builder hears and does because they have been brought under the gracious lordship of a king.
Their obedience is the visible architecture of a life that has already been sovereignly anchored to the bedrock.
Yes.
I think about it like an adopted child. If a child is rescued from a terrible, abusive situation and adopted into a loving, secure, wealthy family, the child doesn't start aggressively doing chores to earn their last name.
They already have the name.
Exactly. The judge hit the gavel. They are already a legally binding member of the family. The adoption is complete and fully paid for by the parents.
But because they are now part of this new family, they slowly begin to take on the characteristics of the family.
Yes. They follow the rules of the house, not out of a terrified fear of being kicked out onto the street, but as a grateful, loving response to the parents who saved them.
The commands of Christ are not a ladder we climb to reach God. The commands are the floor plan of the house we get to live in because we are already saved.
The law of God is no longer a covenant of works that condemns the believer to death. Instead, it becomes a guide, a rule of life that the believer actually delights in.
Because the believer has been regenerated by the Holy Spirit, they possess a new nature that genuinely desires to please God. The continuous doing of the word is the joyful striving of a new creation.
It is imperfect in this life. Yes, we still stumble, but the definitive trajectory of the life is set toward obedience.
So the foundation is settled. We are building on the rock through the obedience that flows from genuine faith.
Let's shift the conversation to the reality of the assault itself, the storm. Because the text points out something that shatters a lot of modern assumptions. The storm hits both houses equally.
Yes, the wise man is not spared the terrible weather.
The text says, the rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew. There is a massive shift in the action here. What happens to the language when the storm arrives?
The shift in syntax is jarring and intentional. We discussed earlier how the builder's obedience is described as an ongoing, continuous lifestyle. But when the text describes the storm, the verbs suddenly shift to depict an action as a whole, a definitive, bounded event.
These are aorist active indicatives, right?
Yes. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew, and beat upon that house. It paints a picture of a specific, violent, and devastating crisis.
While the builder's preparation is a long, slow, continuous process, the testing of that preparation is a sudden, furious, concentrated assault.
And, there is this literary device used here, a polysyndeton, which is the repeated use of the conjunction.
And the rain and the floods and the winds.
Yes. It creates this compounding, accelerating sense of inescapable pressure. It is not just a bad afternoon thunderstorm where you lose power for an hour. It is a multi-front assault.
The water is falling from the sky above, the rivers are rising from below, the wind is tearing at the walls from every side. There is absolutely nowhere to hide.
The accumulation of forces creates an intense, suffocating environment. There are two distinct aspects of this guaranteed storm.
What are they?
First, there are the providential trials of this life. These are the sudden squalls that hit us in a fallen, broken world, receiving a devastating stage 4 medical diagnosis, experiencing sudden financial ruin, the betrayal of a spouse, the unimaginable death of a child, or severe persecution for holding to the faith.
These trials violently test the structural integrity of what we claim to believe.
Absolutely. And second, and vastly more terrifying, is the eschatological storm. This refers to the final, unavoidable cosmic judgment of God, where every hidden foundation will be exposed before his holy, burning scrutiny.
Death and judgment will beat upon every single house without exception. I mean, this totally shatters the modern prosperity gospel, doesn't it?
Completely.
There is this pervasive, toxic idea in our culture that if you just have enough faith, if you decree and declare the right positive words, God will put a protective plastic bubble over your life and you will never experience true hardship.
But Jesus guarantees the storm. The wise man's house is violently beaten. Christianity does not promise immunity from hardship. It promises absolute security in the midst of it.
The prosperity gospel offers a fragile, false shelter that will instantly evaporate the moment real suffering arrives.
Notice that the wise builder is beaten by the wind and rain. The text assumes the house takes a severe hit. Believers are not exempt from the miseries and tragedies of this life. We grieve, we bleed, we suffer.
But the distinction lies in the outcome. The storm does not create the foundation, it reveals it.
Yes. Affliction demonstrates whether a person's religion is anchored to the immovable character of Christ or just resting on the loose sand of their own optimism.
When the storm hits the prosperity gospel adherent, their faith often collapses entirely because their faith was never in the rock. Their faith was in the expectation of good weather.
That is so true.
The storm doesn't create the foundation. It reveals it. That is a massive truth. Let's look at the aftermath. The text says the storm hits, it beats violently on the house, and then we get the result, but it did not fall. Why? Because it had been founded on the rock.
The grammar here is the most comforting piece of reality in the entire passage.
It describes a completed action in the past, right?
Yes, the Greek verb tethamiloto is a pluperfect passive indicative. The tense used here is relatively rare in the New Testament. It is used to describe a completed action in the past that has permanent results carrying forward into the present time of the narrative.
And even more significantly, it is in the passive voice.
The passive voice indicates that the subject, the house, was acted upon by an outside force. It was secured to the rock by someone else.
So, using a modern analogy, you aren't frantically running outside with a hammer, nailing plywood over your windows and trying to pour quick-dry concrete around your foundation while a Category 5 hurricane is already tearing your roof off.
That is way too late.
The structural integrity of the house was established long before the first drop of rain ever fell. The heavy lifting was finished in the past, and you are currently surviving the crisis based entirely on that past completed work.
The theological weight of the passive voice is staggering here. The preservation of the believer is not dependent on the believer's frantic, adrenaline-fueled efforts during the crisis.
We do not keep ourselves saved by our own raw strength when the severe trials come.
Right. The house stood firm because, by the sovereign grace of God, it had already been anchored to the rock. The foundation held.
This doctrine comforts the true believer with the reality of perseverance. If God has given you the grace to dig down and build upon Christ, all the furies of hell and the storms of life cannot sweep you away.
This leads us directly to the core of the matter. Who is the rock? Because if we just read this as build your life on good moral principles and try to be a nice person, we miss the entire point of the text.
Jesus makes an astonishing, universe-altering claim here. He says, everyone who heareth these words of mine.
He isn't quoting another famous rabbi. He isn't pointing to an abstract philosophical framework. He is placing his own words, his own authority, at the very center of ultimate human security.
The audacity of that claim cannot be overstated. In the Old Testament scriptures, the title of rock is exclusively reserved for Yahweh. God alone is the rock of Israel, the fortress, the deliverer.
By identifying his own teaching as the bedrock upon which human beings must stake their eternal destinies, Jesus is unequivocally asserting his own divine authority. He is claiming to be God in the flesh.
Furthermore, the rest of the New Testament explicitly identifies Christ as the cornerstone, the sure foundation laid by God.
To build on the rock is not just to adopt a Christian ethical framework, it is to rest your entire existence, your very soul, on the incarnate Son of God.
We can draw a massive connection here straight to the cross. Jesus, as our great high priest, did not just stand on a hill and hand us a heavy building manual. He actually became the foundation by absorbing the ultimate storm himself. If you look at Calvary, on the cross, the rain of divine justice fell, the floods of God's holy, terrifying wrath against sin rose, and the winds of absolute fury beat against him. He stood in our place. He took the catastrophic storm that our foolish, sandy building deserved.
That is the very heart of the gospel. Where we have heard the word and flagrantly disobeyed, Christ heard the word and obeyed it perfectly.
Where we have foolishly built our lives on sand, he lived every single moment in perfect, unbroken submission to the will of his Father. He fulfilled all righteousness.
At the cross, he endured the eschatological storm of wrath, and the foundation held. He did not fall in defeat. He rose again on the third day, proving that the foundation God laid cannot be shaken by death itself.
We build our lives not on our own flimsy merit, but on his perfect act of obedience, his righteous life, and his passive obedience, his suffering on the cross, which is imputed or credited directly to us by faith.
So let's synthesize all of this. What does this mean for us today, right now?
True discipleship is not about striving for cultural relevance. It is not about an external, showy religion that looks good to the neighbors. It is not about chasing mystical, charismatic experiences that give you goosebumps, but don't actually change how you treat your family.
True discipleship is validated by one thing: building your life on the absolute, unyielding authority of Christ through a relentless pattern of obedient faith.
And that ongoing obedience is the visible evidence that grace has actually done its internal work.
This text calls the church away from pragmatic, entertainment-driven models that seek to attract massive crowds with easy, sandy messages. It demands a return to the serious, joyful work of discipleship, where people are taught to actually observe and execute all that Christ commanded, regardless of the cultural cost.
So, to you, the listener, we address you directly as we wrap up this conversation. The text makes it undeniably clear that a storm is coming. Neutrality is a physical impossibility.
You are actively building right now, today, and the weather will inevitably change. The rain will fall, the floods will rise, the wind will beat against the house. The only question that matters is what lies beneath your floorboards.
Foundations must be laid long before the storm arrives. It is supreme folly to wait until the crisis hits to examine what you are actually trusting in.
The world constantly tells you that appearance is enough, that as long as the house looks good today, as long as the bank account is full and everyone is healthy, you are fine. Christ says the storm will reveal the hidden reality.
We want to leave you with this final thought to mull over as you go about your day. If the final massive storm doesn't create your foundation, but only reviews it, well, what might the small daily squalls in your life right now be exposing?
Think about the minor frustrations: a canceled flight, a harsh word from a friend, a sudden, unexpected bill in the mail.
When those minor winds blow, do you immediately collapse into intense anxiety, explosive anger, or bitter despair? What are your reactions to the small trials right now reveal about the actual bedrock beneath your own feet?